Today we're going to talk about topics 1.2 and 1.3, developments in Dar al-Islam and South and Southeast Asia. So starting with Dar al-Islam, we have talked about the foundations of Islam with Muhammad and how it spread. The term Dar al-Islam means the house of Islam, or basically the Islamic world. And as you read in the first paragraph, the Islamic world stretched all the way from India to Spain, across North Africa and the modern-day Middle East. One of the major Islamic empires as we get to the year 1200 is the Abbasid Caliphate, which we have talked about before. That is where you have the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, the intellectual center of the world at the time. And there were basically four different invasions of the Abbasid Empire, or the Abbasid Caliphate, that caused it to collapse. And the first was the invasion of the Mamluks, who were a group of slaves, usually ethnic Turks from Central Asia. They served as soldiers, later as bureaucrats, and in Egypt, the Mamluks seized control of the government and established the Mamluk Sultanate. So they took over that region of the Abbasid Caliphate in modern-day Egypt. Then you had a group called the Seljuk Turks, who were ethnically Turkish from Central Asia, and they took over a big chunk of the Abbasid Caliphate in the northern or central region of that caliphate and established a sultanate. So the Seljuk leader, instead of calling himself a caliph, was called a sultan, therefore he had a sultanate. And when the Seljuk Turks took over, they also took over what is called the Holy Land, which is modern-day Israel, Jerusalem, and that is a place of enormous religious importance to Christians, Muslims, and Jews. And when the Seljuk Turks took over the Holy Land, they stopped allowing Christians and Jews to make pilgrimages to their holy sites, and they would kill any who tried. And for this reason, you have the third invasion of the Abbasid Caliphate, the Crusades. So the Crusaders came from Europe, and they were attempting to take back the Holy Land for Christians. It was successful at first with the First Crusade, but with subsequent crusades, the Christian Crusaders lost control of the Holy Land to other Muslim groups. And we'll learn more about that later. Then you have the Mongols. This was really the final nail in the coffin of the Abbasid Caliphate. The Mongols conquered the remaining Abbasid Empire in 1258 and ended the Seljuk rule. They continued to push westward, but were stopped in Egypt by the Mamluks. So this is what caused the Abbasid Caliphate to decline. But a few things about the Abbasid Caliphate, culturally and socially. By the 16th century, you have three large Islamic empires existing in what used to be the Abbasid Caliphate. And these became known as the three Islamic gunpowder empires: the Ottoman Empire in Turkey, the Safavid Empire in Persia, and the Mughal Empire in India, all of which we'll talk about much later in topic 3.1. Now, one of the cultural aspects of the Abbasid Caliphate was their use of Sharia law. And Sharia law is the Islamic legal system. In some ways, Sharia is very fair. In other ways, it's more harsh than we're used to in the West. For example, one of the famous laws is that if you steal something, your hand gets chopped off. And in some Muslim-majority countries today, they still have Sharia law, but they certainly did in the Abbasid Caliphate. But the Abbasids also had a lot of cultural innovations. For example, Nasir al-Din al-Tusi was one of the most celebrated Islamic scholars. He contributed to astronomy, law, logic, ethics, mathematics, philosophy, and medicine. Remember how Baghdad was the intellectual center of the world in the 1200s, and Nasir al-Din al-Tusi played a large role contributing to that. This laid the groundwork for trigonometry. Remember, the Abbasids established the Arabic numerals that we use, algebra, and then, as we see here, trigonometry. Ibn Khaldun was the founder of the fields of historiography, which is like the history of history, how historians have interpreted things throughout the ages, and the discipline of sociology, or how people interact with each other. There was also a poet named Aisha al-Ba'uniyah, and she was the most prolific female Muslim writer before the 20th century. Prolific means she wrote a lot. And she was part of a group of Muslims called the Sufis. The Sufis emphasized introspection over sacred texts, over learning. So you see how the Abbasid Caliphate was heavy into learning. The Islamic faith had the Quran, and it relied very much on sacred texts like that. Sufism was still Muslim, but it was kind of a rejection of the traditional Muslim beliefs of sacred text and learning being the way to determine the truth. They looked more inwardly and thought that through mystical introspection, they could determine the truth. All right, next page talks about women in Islam. One term that it includes is the term hijab, a practice in many Muslim countries, and certainly at the time of the Abbasid Caliphate, was women wearing a hijab, which is a head covering that usually covers the hair. That is very different from a burqa. A burqa covers the entire face and body to where you just have a slit for eyes to see out of, but a hijab does not cover the face. One thing that Muhammad did was he forbade female infanticide. Female infanticide is something that would tragically happen far too often in the ancient world, in the medieval world, where baby girls, if they weren't wanted, they would be killed, and that was legal. You also have women's rights enjoying some improvements in the Muslim world. For example, the right to own property. But you also have new limitations in women's rights, and the new status of women might be best symbolized by the veil and the harem. A harem was a dwelling set aside for wives and concubines, which are like mistresses, and many powerful men in the Islamic world had harems for their women. And then getting all the way to Spain. Spain is no longer a Muslim country, but for about 700 years it was. The Islamic Jihad across North Africa stretched into southwestern Europe, into Spain and Portugal in particular, and the Cordoba Caliphate was established. So in 711, after Muslim forces defeated Byzantine armies across North Africa, they successfully invaded Spain from the south. They designated Cordoba as their capital for Spain. They continued to push north into Europe, but were stopped at the Battle of Tours. It says the Islamic army was turned back in 732 when it lost the Battle of Tours against Frankish forces from modern-day France. And it's because of this battle that most of the rest of the continent of Europe remained Christian, but Muslims did rule Spain for the next 7 centuries and would eventually encroach into southeastern Europe too when they took over the Byzantine Empire. But we'll get to that another day. Cultural and scholarly transfers, last part of this chapter. Cordoba had the largest library in the world at the time, so there was a big emphasis in learning in most parts of Dar al-Islam, with the exception of parts controlled by the Sufis. One Islamic scholar was Ibn Rushd. He was known in Europe as Averroes, and he wrote influential works on law, secular philosophy, which means philosophy not tied to religion, and the natural sciences. You also have Ibn Rushd writing commentaries on Aristotle, and his writings influenced a Jewish philosopher named Maimonides and a Christian philosopher named St. Thomas Aquinas. So you have the intellectual advancements made by Dar al-Islam really extending throughout the Islamic world and beyond. All right, then we get to 1.3, developments in South and Southeast Asia. So basically, South Asia is modern-day India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and then Southeast Asia is anything to the east of India and to the south of China. So those are nations like the Philippines, Thailand, Indonesia, etc. One of the key components of the history of South and Southeast Asia at this time is the interaction between Hindus and Muslims. It says the interaction between Hindus and Muslims, though sometimes violent, created dynamic developments in religion, thought, religious thought, politics, economics, art, and architecture. Buddhism had a strong presence in the area, especially in Southeast Asia, as we will get to. So one of the things that really drove history in India, and still in a lot of ways does today, is the interaction, oftentimes adversarial interaction, conflict between Hindus and Muslims. So starting with southern India. Political structures in southern India were more stable than in northern India because northern India was on the border of Dar al-Islam. So northern India was facing invasions from Muslim armies continually, whereas southern India was more isolated from Dar al-Islam. Therefore, there wasn't as much upheaval and takeovers, and it lasted longer. Each kingdom lasted longer. So the first kingdom, called the Chola dynasty, reigned over southern India for more than 400 years as we get into the 1200s. During the 11th century, the dynasty extended its rule into Ceylon, which is modern-day Sri Lanka, which is off the coast of India. Then you have the second kingdom, called the Vijayanagara Empire, and it took its name from the word victorious city. It began with the arrival of two brothers from the Delhi Sultanate in northern India, which was a Muslim empire, and they went south to extend the rule. They had been born Hindus. They converted to Islam for the sake of upward mobility, but when they left the region controlled by the Delhi Sultanate, they once again became Hindu. So the Vijayanagara Empire was Hindu, just like the Chola kingdom was. Political structures in India had a lot more conflict because they were on the border of Dar al-Islam. They had a lot more upheaval. For example, the Rajput kingdoms gradually formed in northern India and present-day Pakistan. They were Hindu kingdoms. They were led by leaders of numerous clans who were often at war with one another. So not only was there a lot of war and conflict between Hindus and Muslims, but there was a lot of wars between Hindus and between Muslims and Muslims. So just a very violent area historically. Because of the competition among clans, no centralized government arose, once again demonstrating the diversity and the regionalism of South Asia. So people did not see themselves primarily as Indians, but as a part of their regional sect. The lack of a centralized power left the kingdoms more vulnerable to Muslim attacks. So, as Islam pushed eastward, the disunity within the Rajput kingdoms made them vulnerable to falling to the Islamic powers who were invading from the west. It says, each attack disrupted a region that had been mostly Hindu and Buddhist. Over time, the Islamic presence in the region grew, which it is still very large in northern India, modern-day Pakistan today. In the 11th century, Islamic forces plundered northern India's Hindu temples and Buddhist shrines for their riches. In addition, they erected mosques, which are places of worship for Muslims, on Hindu and Buddhist holy sites, much to the anger of followers of those faiths. So religion really does play a large role in these conflicts, and a lot of times the warring parties were more religiously motivated than anything else. So the birth of the Delhi Sultanate, this was a long-lasting Muslim empire in northern India, modern-day Pakistan. It says in the early 1200s, Islamic forces managed to conquer the city of Delhi, which is the modern-day capital of India, and much of the northern portion of South Asia. Bringing Islam into India, the Delhi Sultanate reigned for 300 years, from the 13th through the 16th centuries. The interaction of Islam and Hinduism in northern India dominated the political history of the era. That can be really the main idea of this entire section. While some Hindus converted to Islam, others resented Muslims and considered them foreigners. The Delhi Sultanate imposed a tax called the jizya on all non-Muslim subjects of the empire. So in this sense, the jizya that non-Muslims had to pay unless they converted to Islam was an early example of religious freedom for the wealthy, but not so much for the poor, because if you couldn't afford the jizya, you had to convert under strict penalties. So local kingdoms continue to play a very major role in India's decentralized political landscape, and the Delhi Sultanate, as it centralized more, got more and more power and more territory, really dominated the region. The Delhi Sultanate prevented the Mongols themselves from conquering South Asia. We'll talk about the Mongols in Unit 2. But the strength of the Delhi Sultanate is a big reason why, while the Mongols conquered Asia, or most of Asia, I should say, including China and a lot of the Middle East, they did not conquer India. However, in 1526, the sultans did lose power to a new Muslim empire, the Mughals, which we will learn about in Unit 3. Religion in South Asia. Before the arrival of Islam, most South Asians practiced Hinduism, which we've talked a lot about, while a smaller number identified themselves as Buddhists. South Asians encountered a starkly different religion when Islam arrived. So these are the main differences between Hinduism and Islam. Hinduism is polytheistic, believes in many gods, while Islam is strictly monotheistic or believes in one god. Also, Hindu temples and artwork have a lot of pictures of their deities, whereas Islam does not allow any kind of visual representation of Allah or Muhammad. Similarly, you have the difference in social status. So in Hinduism, you have the strict caste system where you're stuck wherever you're born. Islam does not have a caste system, but has more equality for all believers, or at least all male believers. And then you have the Hindus recognizing several sacred texts, for example, the Bhagavad Gita and the Vedas, whereas Muslims mostly look to the Quran for spiritual guidance. The relationship between Hindus and Muslims shaped the history of South Asia beginning in the 7th century, very true, still does today. Islam is different from Hinduism because many times Hindus think of their religion as a regional or a cultural thing, something that's not for everybody. Whereas Islam, similar to Christianity, believes that it is for everybody, that anybody can and should become a part of their religion. And because of that, Muslims proselytize or actively seek converts in much the same kind of idea as Christians evangelizing or spreading the gospel. With its emphasis on the equality of all believers, Islam also attracted low-caste Hindus who hoped that conversion would improve their social status. So both Islam and Buddhism were seen as attractive to many poor Indians who were stuck in the caste system as a way to get out. All right, social structures in India. We've talked about the caste system. It is the strongest historical continuity in the entire history of India, still exists today. It's very rigid. In South Asia, women in the Hindu tradition were confined to a separate social sphere, and Islamic women received similar treatment. So you have the patriarchal tradition, both in Islamic and Hindu cultures. And then in Southeast Asia, women enjoyed more independence before the arrival of Islam. Cultural interactions in South Asia. You have the numeral system, referred to in the West as Arabic numerals, which originated in India, really spreading around Dar al-Islam. In India itself, sultans erected buildings melding the intricate artistic details of Hindu art with the geometric patterns preferred by Islamic architecture. And you can see this especially in the picture on the next page of Qutub Minar. I'll just scroll to that real quick. Here you see a tower, which is a Hindu symbol with a lot of carvings of deities on here, it looks like. And then you see a building with a dome, and that is an Islamic form of architecture. So this is an example of religious syncretism, or at least religions coexisting in the same place, shows the strong influence that both Hinduism and Islam have had in northern India especially. Another consequence of cultural interactions in South Asia between Hindus and Muslims is the emergence of the language Urdu, which is the official language of Pakistan today. The Bhakti movement in Hinduism is very similar to the Sufi movement in Islam, because Bhaktis, like Sufis, think that truth is found inside of yourself through introspection, meditation, contemplation, whereas traditional Hindus and Muslims believe that you find truth through a sacred text and through good behavior. So the Bhakti movement, like the Sufis, it was a mystical movement, one that emphasized inner reflection. All right, then we get to Southeast Asia. Like China, South Asia strongly influenced its neighbors, particularly the lands of Southeast Asia. So in the same way that China spread its culture to East Asia, like Korea, Vietnam, and Japan. In the same way, India very much dominated the traditions of Southeast Asia and influenced them. So that's going to be the nations of Indonesia, Malaysia, Cambodia, Thailand, Laos, Vietnam. Trade voyages in this region introduced the Indian religions of Hinduism and Buddhism to Southeast Asia, and much of the region became and remains today mostly Buddhist. Since Southeast Asia was mostly on the water, you have that being a major trade route, especially between the Chinese and the Indians, because the Himalaya Mountains lie on the border of India and China, and they couldn't cross that very easily to trade with each other, so they traded through Southeast Asia, and that's why Southeast Asia was so religiously diverse, because you have Muslim merchants and Buddhist merchants and Hindu merchants, and later on you have a lot of Christian merchants, especially in places like the Philippines. So that's going to be a very religiously diverse region. Sea-based kingdoms, the Srivijaya Empire was a Hindu kingdom, and the Majapahit kingdom was Buddhist, and it became powerful by controlling sea routes. Then you have land-based kingdoms like the Sinhala dynasties and the Khmer Empire. The Sinhala dynasties were in Sri Lanka, and Buddhism was a major part of it. Then the Khmer Empire, also known as the Angkor Kingdom, is in modern-day Cambodia. Similarly, Buddhism was the major religion there. In 1431, in Thailand, you have the emergence of the Sukhothai Kingdom. That they invaded the area, forcing the Khmers out. Nevertheless, ruins of the magnificent structures in Angkor Thom, Angkor Wat still stand. Okay, so the temples of Angkor are a lasting monument to the Khmer Empire, even after the Sukhothai Kingdom came in and destroyed them. It testifies not only to the sophistication of Southeast Asian culture, but also to the powerful influence of Indian culture on the region. All right, and then the last thing in this chapter, the arrival of Islam in Southeast Asia. Islam spread to Sumatra and Java. Those are part of modern-day Indonesia, as well as the Malay Peninsula. And today, Indonesia includes more Muslims than any other country in the world.